Hey, welcome to the Energy Question Podcast with David Blackman. I am, amazingly enough, your host, David Blackman, surviving here on the floor at NAPE as they're setting this thing up on Wednesday. What's today? The 7th of February?
Yep.
We're here with Stuart Turley, of course, my podcasting partner, Energy News Beat, Sandstone Group. What else, dude?
That's
Three
about it.
podcasters walk into a bar, and Karr Ingham, the executive vice president, acting president of the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers, petroleum economist extraordinaire. Karr, how you doing today?
I'm doing good, David Blackman. Stu, good to see you guys and appreciate the kind words. Completely made up, but I
It's easy
appreciate
to
the
say
kind
words for somebody who does such great work for the industry, putting out the Texas Petro Index for what, since 1997?
Yeah, well, it's based in 1995, actually created the thing in 02, 03, and we rolled it out as the Alliance in
Okay.
2003.
Okay, well, it's
So 20 plus years we've been putting this thing out now.
and so what's the purpose? Tell us the purpose of the Texas Petro Index.
Well, several years ago, and by several, I mean coming up on 25 or 30 now. In the late 90s, I was doing general economic analysis at the city metro level around Texas. And one of the early places I started doing that was in Midland, Odessa. And of course, it doesn't take you know, you don't even have to be very smart to figure this out. You can't do general economic work in Midland, Odessa without turning yourself into an oil and gas guy. And so I created a kind of regional oil and gas activity index out there called the Texas Permian Basin Petroleum Index.
Right.
And this was just an activity index to lay down next to the general economic index. And everybody knows what this looks like. And in the Permian, unlike anywhere else in the country, and in Midland, Odessa, whatever oil and gas does is what the general economy does. But we still needed to kind of quantify this and show what that looks like and create a picture of it, which we did with these two indexes. General economic index for the combined Midland, Odessa metro area, and then the regional oil and gas index. Well, the Alliance, the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers, which you may recall, did not exist as a statewide organization until 2000, but its two predecessor associations date back to the 1930s. That's North Texas Oil and Gas Association and West Central Texas Oil and Gas Association. So these two guys, Alex Mills with North Texas and Bill Stevens with West Central Texas, took notice of this. And I was also doing general economic work in Abilene, where West Central Texas was, and we would talk oil and gas, and Bill Stevens would come participate in some of these things. And so they caught sight of the Permian Basin piece and asked me to create a statewide upstream oil and gas activity index that really, again, paints a picture of the upstream oil and gas economy in Texas. And so I said, well, yes, absolutely. I'd be thrilled and honored to do this. And so, as any index does, you pick an arbitrary point in time.
Right.
In our case, January 1995. Yeah. And you pick an arbitrary number, 100.0 in our case. And you calibrate all of these indicators, representative components of the upstream industry in Texas, and calibrate them all to January 1995. Well, then you just calculate that thing every month going forward, and we've done it every month since then. And what are these components? Forgive the econ speak, but I would be asking these questions if I were listening to me do this out there. Inflation adjusted, which is critical. I mean, it's just critical. Inflation adjusted prices paid to producers for crude oil and natural gas. Statewide rig count. Yep. Number of drilling permits issued by the great state of Texas, oil and gas well completions,
right? The
estimated volume and real, which is to say inflation adjusted over time value of crude oil and natural gas production.
Wow.
And then last but not nearly least, the number of people that are employed directly by the upstream oil and gas industry in Texas, which is what? People on the payrolls of operating and producing companies, drilling companies, service companies. That's upstream oil and gas employment to me. And so we put all these into this index, and I create this model and turn out the Texas Petro Index every month. So that's what it is, and that's its history.
How much in billions? Because I know you and I have talked about this in state revenue taxes from the oil and gas industry. That is such a boon for Texas.
Oh, well, think about what this is. So the industry directly pays money into the state's coffers.
Right.
Most directly, they do this by paying a severance tax. I mean, just call it a production tax. If you bring a barrel of oil or an MCF to the surface, with a few exceptions, you're paying a little money off the top of the revenue of that barrel or MCF into the state coffers, and it's called a severance tax. Once you sever it from the earth,
Oh, wow.
um, then you're paying a little money to the state of Texas. And then the industry is a huge direct payer of the sales tax. Huge. They pay motor vehicle taxes. They have fleets. They buy
I
cars.
feel left out. Huge.
Huge, huge. And hotel motel taxes. I mean, just go to Midland and look at who's parked in the parking lots of every hotel around there. And it's every service company using those hotels as work week housing, particularly when they had a massive housing shortage out there and things were booming. So they're paying directly into the state coffers. In addition, they're paying localized ad valorem taxes on the value, essentially the value, producible value of their reserves to school districts, municipalities, hospital districts. I mean, the amount that the industry pays in terms of funding local municipalities and school districts and hospital districts and you name it is just astounding. I mean, add all of this together and you're 20-30 billion dollars in the state of Texas. But I mean, think of it. So the state of Texas gets revenue, broadly speaking, from two sources: from the taxes it collects on all of us and industry, you know, every state tax there is. And then we get a fair amount of federal government money as Texas revenue. The part that
Let's talk about that then.
no, well, and I'd rather not talk about that. But so let's carve that out and just think about all the Texas taxes collected. And you've got somewhere between 20 and 25% of all state taxes that are collected that are paid directly by the oil and gas industry. That's a massive number. And just imagine if this goes away.
And Texas GDP is number 7 if it was a country in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I haven't looked at that number in a while, but it's 6 or 7. I mean,
And is
we're
Texas
just big.
the 3rd largest energy producer in the world? Or the largest?
The last time I looked at that number, which was early 2022 when Russia-Ukraine started happening and prices started to skyrocket, and I put those numbers together and it was US at the top,
Right.
Russia, Saudi Arabia, and then Texas was maybe 4th or 5th on that list.
Well,
Texas would be 3rd on natural gas and 4th on cruise.
See, there's a guy who knows stuff.
But on
And
LNG, the US is number 1 on export.
Oh, absolutely.
And Qatar is probably going to surpass us in the next 8 months if I was calculating with a
yeah, I mean
grade.
the global LNG powers are us, Russia, Qatar, but we're at the top of that food chain, and rightly so. We're trying to screw that up, as you well know, but hopefully
right.
we won't get that done.
So you just issued a new iteration of the Texas Petro Index. I got some questions specific to that for you. But first, talk about where the index stands right now. I assume it's a pretty healthy state.
It's a pretty healthy state, but the nature of this thing has changed. There have been structural changes in the upstream oil and gas industry in Texas, and they're all for the good. I mean, you look at this thing and you say, okay, was that really for the good? It's just a different scenario. It used to be that a boom in Texas oil and gas, the Texas oil and gas industry, upstream segment of the industry, a boom was really clearly defined.
Yes.
A boom is defined by growing rig counts, growing numbers of drilling permits issued, growing numbers of employment, and actually relatively minimal effect on production itself, just the volume of stuff produced. An extraordinary effect on the value of that production as prices go up, but on the actual volume, relatively minimal effects on the actual production volume. So, well, how's this changed? I mean, the apex is at the top point. Anyway, the all-time high of the Texas Petro Index.
Thanks for making me feel good.
Yes.
I did that just for you, Stu. The all-time high of the Petro Index was at the end of the last true, easily defined boom in oil and gas, Texas and nationally. And that's in the end of 2014.
That's what
So you had
I-
all-time record employment for sure, not an all-time record rig count because you got to go back to the 1980s for that, but certainly in modern oil and gas, the highest it's been and will ever be again was in late 2014. Same with drilling permits. Um,
But Karr, what about, and David, what about the advances in technology that have?
well, see, Stu, you're jumping the gun here. So,
I'm so sorry.
no, I'm kidding. Exactly where I was headed. Now we have I'm just giving you a hard time, man. Hush up. I'm just kidding. Yeah, that's a very astute observation because it's really at the crux of what's happening.
Thank you very much.
Certainly post 2014, 2015. You know, we had a nasty bloodbath of an industry downturn, as
Okay.
you know, 2015 and 2016. And you would think as we recover from this that we would start getting back and returning to prior rig count levels, prior employment levels, drilling permits, all of these things. No, not at all. We have not sniffed 2014 levels
Mm-mm.
in terms of the rig count, permits, employment for sure. What we are doing as we're not growing all of these things is growing production itself. So we started to set new all-time production records in early 2018 maybe for crude oil in Texas. And I mean breaking 1972 production volume records.
Right.
So we did that in I think early 2018, continued to grow production right up until March of 2020. And so just in advance of COVID, we had about 5.45 million barrels a day in Texas. Oh, by the way, crude oil production in Texas in 2010, about 1 million barrels a day.
Right.
Million barrels a day to 5.45 million barrels a day. And then, of course, in April and May, it falls off the cliff because of COVID. Then we start to finally we start to recover this number, but we don't get back to that 5.45 million until March of 2023.
Wow.
And we've continued to set records since then. So we're coming up, we're over 5.6 million barrels a day in Texas now. So we're setting crude oil production records in Texas and nationally, but we're doing so without record rig counts, without record employment, without record drilling permits, fewer resources being deployed to produce record and growing volumes of crude oil and natural gas in Texas and nationally, but it's all led by Texas and the Permian.
And that's all created by technology, right? And process advancements
Sure.
that are dramatically over the last 5 years raised the per well recoveries in the shale.
Just extraordinary gains in efficiency and productivity. That's what's at the heart of all of this. This is, by the way, what all industries endeavor to do over time. Produce more with fewer resources deployed and at a lower cost.
Is there
But we-
any industry that is as good at that?
I don't look at as many as certainly as directly as I do oil and gas, but it's hard to imagine that oil and gas is rivaled by any other industry in terms of the extraordinary efficiency and productivity gains that have been achieved really for the benefit of the American people. But what does that mean in terms of what we think of the oil and gas industry and its connection to the Texas economy? You know, back in the 80s, oil and gas was directly a massive portion of the Texas economy. Even by, you know, the 2008 timeframe, as we're growing up through mid 2008 before the onset of the Great Recession, the oil and gas economy in Texas was probably 12 to 14% directly of the overall state economy. Now that number might be 6 or 7%.
Yeah. It's become so huge and diversified.
Well, that's exactly right. But again, we're having to use fewer Texas economic resources to produce these massive, again, record and growing volumes of crude oil and natural gas, and doing it with fewer employees. By the way, I mean we had 307,000 ish direct upstream employees in December of 2014. That number's maybe 200,000
Wow.
right now, and we'll never get back to 300,000 again. I mean, it just doesn't need to.
Well, you know, I mean, but that's a positive thing when you consider the health of the state economy as a whole, right?
That's exactly
Because
right.
there's all these alternatives now because of all the diversification.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got medical, you've got technology, you still have agriculture, which is a massive player in Texas. But we are an extraordinary, strong, large, huge, diversified economy, and oil and gas is a big part of the mix. So economic impact of the industry is one thing, what we pay in terms of
Right.
taxes, employment. These are, by the way, the highest paying jobs in Texas easily.
Right.
So they're high impact jobs with big wages.
But Karr, and David, the one of the key reasons for Texas success is the low cost of energy. And when you take a look, we're half of New York and half of California. And people are moving out of those places because of the policies up there. So great job on tracking those things, because the cost per kilowatt hour, thanks to our great natural gas, is even bringing in.
Guys, I talked with Robert Bryce yesterday. We did an
Oh, yeah.
episode with Robert Bryce.
Yeah, great.
Just tremendous.
Absolutely.
tremendous
I love
analyst.
Robert Bryce.
Yeah, he's one of the best. He pointed out to me that in San Diego, I was complaining about my 11 cents per kilowatt contract, fixed
Right.
contract through August, right? And then I can renegotiate. In San Diego, folks, it's 48 cents
Oh my
per
goodness.
kilowatt hour. Nobody in Texas is paying that or
No.
anything close to that.
No. And they're not paying for housing here, what they're paying there, although our housing
And-
market's going
and
up.
Karr just
Taxes, oh my goodness
in the
gracious.
green room, Karr just told me that he hopes you leave your voting policies there.
Did I say
if
that?
you move.
You're moving for a reason, my friend. Well, I don't know why you'd want to turn us into them, so let's not.
It's great. You told us in the green room.
I don't see
Any
any green.
Just kidding to all our California folks.
Correct. And I didn't get any snacks in that green room either. So
Well,
we'll talk about
the
that.
mini candy bars are over here.
Fair enough.
Just
Fair
serve yourself.
What
Fair
else is
enough.
going on, man? What's happening at the Alliance?
Well, so the Alliance again became a statewide organization in 2000, and on the day of its formation, just because of the history and legacy of North Texas and West Central Texas, that was an influential organization then. But then you throw in a guy named Alex Mills, who was president of North Texas Oil and Gas Association, became president of the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers, and give him about 18 years, 17 or 18 years until he retired at the end of 2017 to grow this organization into a large 3,300 member,
Oh, yes.
influential, impactful statewide oil and gas association that, by the way, does advocacy work in both Austin and DC. But who do we do this for? We do this, the Alliance has as its legacy and history and still current focus, independent oil and gas producers, independent oil and gas companies, the independent oil and gas industry, which is not just operators and producers, tons of independent, smaller drilling companies and service
Family-owned.
companies out there. I'm telling you, family-owned companies. So we have larger members of the Alliance
Nice.
because we can come alongside them and work with them in Austin to accomplish things that are helpful to them. And for the most part, they don't conflict with the interests of independent operators. And so we're proud to have larger companies as members. And listen, you're not going to hear me talking these guys down. We need every barrel from where we can get it. But when you think about how the industry is structured, you've got great big guys drilling boomer wells out in the Permian and in other parts, but their focus is on the Permian for a reason.
Right.
But then you've got oil and gas wells all over the state of Texas that have been drilled by these large companies originally. And then as they move on through the progression of business, they hand these companies, these wells off to smaller and smaller companies.
Right.
But these guys are still drilling in West Texas, the Panhandle, North Texas, West Central Texas, East Texas. Permian is really, where most of the drilling happens. But man, I talked to one of our members who's just completed a new gas well in North Texas out there. So this is still happening. So
And,
you've
and
got,
the Eagle Ford's got a research.
oh, absolutely. I mean, well, first of all,
and the
I mean,
Haynesville.
don't you love this about Texas? There was not a barrel of oil to speak of produced in the Eagle Ford until what, 2008
Right.
sometime, and just leave it to Texas to explode this brand new production region onto the scene in 2008.
Yep.
And that production was really fantastic up until the downturn of 2015 and 2016.
Yep.
You know,
And
before 2015, there were 275 active drilling rigs in the Eagle Ford Shale alone. And
Wow.
now the rig count is 499 nationwide. So that's
Sure.
how much it has changed.
that's absolutely right. So that was the blooming rose on the scene in the late 2000s. But all the while we're talking about the Eagle Ford, I'm just sort of watching the Permian percolating over there, and
Right,
just
yeah.
kind of this rumbling underneath the surface. And I just had this sense that crazy, extraordinary things were getting ready to happen out there. The Permian was not leading the way in terms of these new drilling technologies, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. But man, when it took hold out there, here's where we find ourselves. And now you've got the Permian as a whole, including New Mexico, producing more crude oil than the state of Texas as a whole. So if you want to line up who's biggest, now you have to slot the Permian in above Texas. And that hasn't been that way for very long. It certainly was not the case 10 or 12 years ago. So that's pretty extraordinary. But anyway, the Alliance has, again, as our representative focus, independent oil and gas companies, smaller independents in particular, people that don't have their own government relations shop,
Nice.
not employees. They're not hiring their government relations consultants. Who do they rely on? They rely on us, the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers.
Get your work
Take
cut
their-
out for you.
I'm telling you, we got our work cut out for us.
Yeah. I
Um,
wanna also, just to add in here, I was always with the larger independents, Burlington Resources and then El Paso Corporation in my career. And I always made sure we were part of the alliance and supporting the alliance and the work you do in Austin and Washington, because it's always done. That association has always been really one of the very most effective voices for our industry in Texas in both of those places. And, I always made
That's
sure our
great.
company was in there, even though we had our own government affairs shop.
Sure. And again, this is not unique. We still have, I mean, Diamondback's a great member of ours.
Yeah.
Pioneer's a member of ours.
Yeah.
Oxy, Chevron,
Nice.
ConocoPhillips, who I call the major independent. I mean, they're still independent, but they're major independent. That's a great company,
It is.
ConocoPhillips.
It's
And
fantastic.
they're all members of ours, and I'm thrilled to death that they are.
Although I'm
But
still mad at ConocoPhillips for buying Burlington Resources.
I
will.
can't do anything for you there. So I'll let you take that up
Yeah,
with them.
he was
but,
also telling you in the green room. David was telling you in
that
the green room how bitter he
mystical
was.
he was. I said,
Hogwash.
and we're really the only Texas organization that directly plays in DC. Austin is a place you can work. We have a sensible legislature.
Yep.
We have a sensible governor, lieutenant governor. We have a sensible but very effective, know what they're doing, regulating agency for the industry in Texas, which is the Railroad Commission. The TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, does their work, but they're not insane about this. They're not the EPA, thank goodness. And so Austin, we can be very effective there because the state of Texas understands this industry. DC is a much more difficult slog, but it's where independents get hammered now. All of these things, every bad tax policy
Right.
that has something to do with
Quad O regulation.
oil and gas and now methane.
Oh, my
DC is
goodness.
all methane all the time now.
Yeah.
And so quad O,
What are you doing
B,
there? 'Cause
quad
that-
O's. Well,
David and I have been talking about that on a lot of.
well, the first thing we did, and we've been active in DC as an organization, just with staff and volunteer folks that'll go do the work up there. The Alliance hired a DC lobbyist in 2020, 2021, somewhere around in there. So we've got the great Chris Kearney, who does work for us up there. He also does work for the National Stripper Well Association. We got a lot of common membership and interests in those two groups. and does some, I think, work for Permian Basin as well. So we have our own DC lobbyists to carry the ball for us in DC, and we still go up there and do the work, but you got to have a guy on the ground there, and we do.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so EPA is a tough place to get into and talk to anybody about anything now because they don't want to hear it. I don't think EPA cares whether smaller independent oil and gas companies exist or not. And they're doing their level best to put them out of business, or if not put them totally out of business, shut in a large section of their wells. And so oh man, think about what we had leading up to this, last reversal in the House where the Republicans got a majority. Before that,
Mini majority, yeah.
but it's helpful because they can throw up a wall to the worst of these things. And what you had there was a couple of years where you had Biden, a Democrat House, Democrat Senate. They all hate oil and gas. They have no affinity at all for smaller independent oil and gas producers. Pardon me.
They don't have any affinity for Texas.
They certainly do not have any affinity for Texas.
But how do we get around in solution wise? And this is a question for both of you, because I'm a little weirded out by the legislation through regulations or the regulatory process. How do we get around the EPA or the forceful nature of these regulatory issues that are killing us? Scope 1 emissions, scope 2, scope 3. How in the world can this new
How in the world,
regulation?
indeed. Yet another astute observation by the great Stuart.
Oh,
Turley.
I'm so sorry.
Think about how this.
I'm sorry.
Think about how this works. These guys, and I'm speaking principally of EPA, but also SEC, which is the scope 1, scope 2
Right.
ESG nonsense. These guys are operating under the, I think, really misguided notion that the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act of the early 1970s,
Right.
whatever the authorizing act for SEC was, I forget. But anyway, it's about that dated as well.
Right.
They believe that these pieces of legislation from decades ago authorize them and permit them to do any blooming thing they want to now. And they believe, well, it's justified because we were authorized to do so under the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act of early 1970, whatever. Same with the SEC. So what does that mean? That means Congress, number one,
Right.
has utterly abdicated its authority and responsibility to the agencies rather than, listen, if Congress wants to put a methane regulation into place, introduce a bill, debate it, see if you can get it passed, and see if you can get it signed. If you do, I might not like it, but at least you've gone through the process. Same with this SEC nonsense on requiring these emissions, climate change related additions to financial disclosures and, things that take what are very defined financial targets, revenue, expense, profit, return on investment, things that are that are clearly defined, and you know what they look like over time. Not so with this climate change nonsense. A very moving target, and I assure you that target will never be met to their satisfaction.
Oh no. Since this is on the energy question, I can sit here and say, do you want to know what that man does on his other podcasts? And I mean, this is a hoot. He had one with Megan Lapp. And I mean, she is a great lady that is advocating for the whales and the fisheries and the wind farms. I want to just give a shout out to the Biden administration for doing something right. They're equally racist to all people, all forms of energy, because they're regulating the snot out of everybody, raising the price for the consumers and killing the whales. You got to give them a hand.
At least they're consistent. This is what you're saying. I guess there's something to be said for that. But again, where we're talking about the extraordinary economic impact of the industry in Texas and beyond, but we're certainly in Texas, of just what oil and gas producers do of all scopes and sizes. The real benefit, though, is to the consuming public. I mean, what have we done? I mean, you two know as well as I do that as recently as mid 2000s, we were importing easily the lion's share of our petroleum energy consumption. I mean, 65% or so of our crude oil usage came to us from outside the country. We were dependent on geopolitical events that happened over there. They're spiking prices upward all the time. And so the mantra then was, boy, wouldn't it be great if we were not so reliant on these foreign sources of crude oil, and particularly from we've had a long connection with Canadian crude oil, so that's great. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about OPEC, Middle East. So what did we do? Well, we finally achieved.
Excuse
I
me.
say we, yeah, feel better now. We finally achieved what everybody said. I, oh, well, you quit laughing and then I'll
Sorry.
finish this one.
Sorry.
We finally achieved, we meaning not me. I've never produced a barrel or an MCF of anything. And I stand in awe of people that do,
too.
because
Me
what
too.
did they do? They put a lot of capital at risk for one thing, and they figured out ways to grow U.S. domestic. I mean, I don't mean grow, I mean explode U.S. domestic crude oil production to where we are much less reliant. I mean, that 65% went down to 14 or 15%,
They're
and
much
maybe
more
lower.
net export.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just by adding that volume to global supply, we've really stabilized markets, kept consumers from being impacted by any short-term or long-term impact, negative impact on supply. This is extraordinary. We've
Wow.
kept energy prices low and stable to consumers. And I mean, from electric power to a gallon, the price of a gallon of gasoline, which is, consumers metric about energy costs out there. What am I paying for gasoline today and this week? And this thing that we said we always wanted in the U.S., affordable, reliable, abundant energy. These things are all created, and the latter two come from the abundant part. We've created abundancy in U.S. domestically produced petroleum energy, both crude oil and natural
Most
gas.
of it here in Texas.
Boy, have we ever. I mean, again, we've led the way here with a six-fold increase. And in 2010, Texas was producing a fifth of all U.S. crude oil. Well, that's a big enough number coming out of one
Right.
state. You know
Oh,
what that
yeah.
number is now? 43%.
Wow.
43% of all U.S. crude oil production, great state of Texas. 45 for
How much?
34% of the natural gas in December. I don't know what it
Wow.
is.
Yeah, it's a big number.
Yeah.
But and cutting into us a little bit is the great Marcellus up
Well,
there.
of course, yeah.
So we'll let them have their due.
But you know what? Again, we're going to give a shout out to the Biden administration to keep Texas up there, because they have got so many pipeline regulatory issues and shutting down. The Marcellus could just blow us out if the Biden administration would actually
Well,
try
how
to.
fortunate are we that number one, we're coastal.
Right.
So, and number two, we're connected to Mexico. So we don't have to go intrastate with a lot of
Gas.
Texas produced natural gas. We can pipe it to the coast and get it on out of here. We can pipe it to Mexico across the border and send it down there for their use. So thank goodness. Listen, the Biden administration has a Texas problem.
Right.
We don't have a lot of federal lands and waters in Texas.
Right.
And our pipelines don't really, I mean, there's some obviously, but our from the field to the market pipelines don't largely leave the state of Texas. They're trying to figure out how to cut into us. They can't do it with the stroke of a pen,
but they can do it with the EPA.
but they can do it with the EPA.
Well, they can limit our export growth. They can limit the contracts with the ban.
Sure. Every bad decision you can make, they are making. And I don't mean just bad for oil and gas.
By the election. Politics.
Is this even a question that whether this is politically motivated or not? No, absolutely not. Which tells you what you need to know. Listen, I've got a problem with this term, the public interest. And yet again, this is an authorizing piece of legislation from decades ago that says we're going to do these export facility reviews and make sure they're in the so-called public interest. Well, I guess 40 years ago, maybe you didn't see it coming, that some kind of fanatical administration that has at its singular agenda and misguided agenda at that, climate change, would begin to make some public interest determination about whether or not these facilities are authorized. In addition, as David mentioned earlier, to being an exec, whatever you want to call it, at the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. And I've been our EVP for a while. And as he said, I'm currently our interim president. Mostly what I am is an economist, and I'm a market economist, and I'm a dogged, unapologetic, um, unambiguous free market guy.
Isn't
And
that great?
there's no wiggle room for me on this.
I knew I liked you.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
And I think the public interest determination is made when somebody determines there's a market for these facilities, determines there's a market for that product,
Right.
and determines that money can and should be put at risk to
Mhm.
bring these things into being and foster these processes. I am an unambiguous free trader as well, meaning, and again, I'll come into conflict with some people over this, but whatever. I don't care.
It's only his show that you can cancel.
That's true. One of my heroes, the great Dr. Walter Williams, used to sit in for Rush now and again.
Oh, he's fantastic.
He is fantastic. He passed away, what, a year or two ago, which is a great loss. 6'7", 6'8" black guy out of Philadelphia, used to be a Marxist kind of guy, turned into one of the most extraordinary free market economists that I've ever known or known of. But
Right.
in some of his later speeches, he used to say, listen, at this stage of the game, just have at me. I'm uninsultable. So there's nothing you can say to me. That's kind of how I feel about this now. I'm uninsultable at this stage of the game. So I don't mind having this free trade argument with anybody. So what does free trade mean? It means that the government has very little to do, or should have very little to do, with what comes in here and goes out of here. And we're talking about sending, just think about the development of this process. My goodness, you produce natural gas in extraordinary and growing quantities, and you get it to the coast, and some company that has put billions and billions and billions of dollars into learning this process, establishing these facilities, turn natural gas into something that's loadable onto a boat and shippable across the ocean in significant enough volumes to make an extraordinary difference in supply in whatever part of the world you happen to be talking about.
Europe would be absolutely dead without it.
They most certainly would. And so this is the essence of trade and free trade, and energy trade has just been put at risk because, I mean, the administration may well approve these after the election, which again is pure nonsense. But what they've done is insert.
Do you think it's nonsense?
I think it's nonsense.
Okay, I was just checking. I think nonsense.
This is just Karr's opinion. But, yes. But what they've done is just insert this extraordinary level of uncertainty now into any investor, anybody who's thinking about plunking money down to create one of these facilities and as a part of this process. And I don't know. I mean, good and well that these DC folks, well-intentioned, I don't know, have no knowledge of what this process actually looks like and entails. And this is why we turn these decisions over to the market rather than politically motivated and politically self-interested folks up there. And while I'm sermingizing about this stuff.
All right, one last point.
We're
over time.
Oh, of course we are. I tend to do that. Think about what all this means. Just think about Green New Deal, which, by the way, I was the first guy that I know of to call this Green Raw Deal. So anyway, that was a long time ago when that first came out. Think about what that and everything that's happening now is kind of affiliated with that concept, right? What does that do? Our economy as a country was based on free markets and people around the country making everyday economic decisions for themselves, for their household, for their family, and for their business. And so economic decision-making power was very broadly diffused across the country and all of its players and states. The Green New Deal, the Green Raw Deal, everything we're talking about now takes that power, yanks it out of the hands of you and me, the states, our citizens, households, and businesses, and concentrates it in the hands of a few, let's just call them elites. It's an overused term, but it's true. decision-making people in DC who think they know more than you do, who think they know better than you do. Even the best intention of those, I would not trust to run this economy because they don't have the knowledge of the complex interworkings of the economy. One of the most brilliant economists there ever was, the great F.A. Hayek, used to call this the knowledge problem. And the knowledge problem means you don't have it. I'm sorry. You don't have the knowledge to run this economy. So you have to leave it in the hands of markets. And all of these things that are green raw deal related, yank this power out of the hands of markets and concentrate it in the world of politics.
Yeah. Karr,
Thank you, David.
thank you, sir. This has been an education as usual.
Pleasure was mine.
Appreciate
Thank you
it.
guys for having me.
I was doing my Biden imitation.
We're gonna do another episode with Karr later today, so that's awesome. Thank y'all for joining us. We'll talk to you again very soon.